midwinter, it's cold, the birds are singing. So what am I doing out here in midwinter? Well, yes, this is a public interest before corporate interest YouTube presentation, and I'm interested today in canvassing the concept of change. How do we achieve change? Do we sit in the tent, or do we dance outside the tent? Do we participate in parliamentary elections, or do we ignore parliamentary elections? That's the issue. How do you achieve change in a Western liberal democracy where we have a representative democratic system? Now, obviously, change has never been initiated by those who exercise power and centralise wealth. The only change they initiate is change which reinforces their power and wealth. And over the last 4 decades, we've seen this occur across the globe during the neoliberal revolution which has swept the country and which has swept the globe. A revolution which has been exceptionally profitable for a small percentage of the population around the world. So how do you achieve change? Well, and why involve yourself in politics or political campaigns or activism? Now, obviously, in a parliamentary system, the more pressure which is placed on those who currently represent people, the more chances of legislative change occurring. Now, we are all involved in personal change, and we can be involved in community change, and as a medical practitioner for the last 45 years I've assisted many people. But as an individual I've made no impact on this country's legislative agenda, and that's why we form public interest before corporate interests, because it's all very well raining rocks on the tent, but sometimes it's easier to achieve change which is useful by working up the right channels. I'm not talking about working up the right channels by working up in these committees and consultative processes which are supposedly there to assist us, but in reality are there to squash change. I'm talking about raining on their parade, an appropriate concept as I look around, waiting for the rain to pour down. I'm talking about pissing on their front porch. Because unfortunately in Australia we've had a two-party system from federation over 120 years, and we've seen two major political parties exercise power. And I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted to people is the amount of power that can be exercised by the state. I know we continually say that real power doesn't lie in Parliament, that it lies in the boardrooms of national and transnational corporations. And in many regards, the representatives, our parliamentary representatives, are nothing more than corporate puppets. But there is an issue that we need to look at very closely. Now, they don't care if you don't vote, although we have a compulsory voting system in this country, and they don't particularly care if you vote informal. And you'll notice that in many democratic countries around the world, or parliamentary democracies around the world, I won't use the word democratic, but parliamentary democracies around the world, that participation rates sometimes are less than 50%. But this has no impact on who has their levers on legislative change. In Australia, unlike many other parliamentary democracies, we have no mechanism via which the people can alter the constitution as they do in Switzerland or various states of the United States of America, where if a significant section of the population raises an issue, it has to be put to the people in a referendum. In this country, it's only Parliament and the party of a majority in both houses of Parliament which can actually put constitutional questions to the people, and they formulate the question. So if you live in a society where the consultative process is a farce, and there is no mechanism via which you can change issues through a referendum, because you cannot create a referendum, and if you live in a society where the only participation you have is casting a vote every 3 to 4 years, whether it's a federal or state election, to ignore that process is to not take advantage of one point in time when citizens who have the right to vote think about ideas. So how does change occur? Well, change begins from the grassroots. All change begins from the grassroots. In the Western colonial world, if it wasn't for the Quakers, a pacifist Christian group, beginning the struggle against slavery and then escalating that struggle over centuries, then we'd still have slavery in the Western world. If there wasn't a grassroots push to introduce the vote for women over a century ago in the Western world, there'd be no vote for women. If there wasn't a push for the introduction of a social security system to provide for the basic necessities of people in this country, there'd be no social security system. Nothing occurs without grassroots activity. And because you have won certain rights, they can easily be lost, as we've seen in this country with the right to strike, which is limited now to a brief period during enterprise bargaining period, where you've got to jump through so many hoops, there's no point. So you can win rights, but you can lose rights. So Parliament still plays an important part in creating legislation which changes the lives of millions of people. As we saw with the introduction of Medibank and then Medicare in 1973, the Whitlam Labor government's most important initiative. And as we saw with the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme a few years ago by the Gillard-led Labor government. Legislation can be passed which can have a profound impact on the lives of millions of people. And that's the difference between agitating for change at a grassroots level, working for a charity, providing services to people, a small group of people as an individual. That is the difference. When legislation is passed, you have the whole state apparatus which is there to ensure that that legislation is enforced. That's what the courts are there for. That's what the police are there for. That's what the army is there for, the armed services is there for. It is their role to ensure that legislation is enforced. And if you have people in Parliament who continue to pass legislation which concentrates power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands, you continue to have problems. And as I keep saying in these little presentations, we don't live in Bangladesh. We haven't got 150 million people living on a floodplain. We haven't had to take in 1 million refugees from Myanmar who fled over the border 3 years ago from the Myanmar military. We have 25 million people living on a resource-rich continent, and on this continent we continue to have almost 1 million children living in poverty. We have 1/3 of the population living at a subsistence level because of an inadequate social security system. We continue to create billionaires at our Olympic pace, 100 metres pace, and we continue to have issues which we shouldn't have issues. And to a significant degree, we find ourselves in this situation because of the legislation which has been passed through Parliament. And it's not just a matter of legislation, it's a matter of ideas. The means of communication in this country are held in corporate hands, and to a lesser degree in the government-gelded Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as well as social media. And those of you who think that social media is some type of saviour, it is not. Social media has turned out to be a brake on activism, because you click a button on social media, because you are involved in some vociferous discussion about some esoteric point, you think things will change. They don't change. Ultimately, it's feet on the street, and that's the discussion and expansion of new ideas. Ideas which somehow never seem to be seriously raised or discussed in communication in this country, especially in the legacy media, which continues to set the political, social, cultural, environmental agenda on social media, on television, on radio, and community discussion. It's the same ideas over and over again. Where's the discussion about a universal basic income? Where's the discussion about nationalising this country's national resources and using the profits that are made from this country's national resources to address the climate emergency and to provide resources not only to this country's First Nations people but to the rest of us? Where is the discussion about the type of immigration policies we have? Where is the discussion about poverty in this country? Where is the discussion about the limitations of parliamentary democracy? That we don't have citizens-initiated referendums in this country which allows the people to initiate legislative change through a referendum? Where is the discussion about what's happened to our public assets, how they continue to be privatised? Where is the discussion about the extraordinary powers that the states, as well as the Commonwealth, is able to exercise during a national emergency, not just a pandemic, but an emergency, where all rights are removed? Where is the discussion about the lack of constitutional rights in this country? Where is the discussion about the climate emergency and the best way to deal with the climate emergency, not creating a new revenue source through green capitalism for the same people that have created the climate emergency? Where is the discussion about the centralisation of power in this country and the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands? And you don't see that discussion in the Senate or the House of Representatives in this country. because that discussion is dominated by political parties who are basically manipulated by that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And when you look at the crossbenchers, that motley crew, the majority, over 90%, are nothing more than apologists for some of the most cruelest, racist, misogynist policies in this country. So why don't we ever have people elected to the Senate or the House of Representatives which have policies which promote equality? Not just people who are elected on the basis of a specific issue, but people who are elected on the basis of their resistance to capitalism, private investment for private profit. You don't see that. And you won't see that unless we have political parties that have a broad range of policies which tackle the root causes of inequality in this country, and that is concentration of power and wealth. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is many of the reforms which occurred during the previous 100 years have been swept away by political parties who take their marching orders from those who exercise power, not from the people they represent. And that's what the parliamentary system does, and that's what a two-party system does. Now, we like to criticise the Chinese for having a one-party state. Well, in this country we have a two-party state, and both parties owe their allegiance to that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and pander to their whims. And if they had policies which went against their whims, then maybe we'd have a different country. So we need to break down the two-party system. We need to be more active on the streets. We need to be more organised. And in order to do that, we need an organisation, whether it's a political party or not, which challenges the basic assumptions that this country is built on. The assumption that we are an egalitarian community. The assumption that we are a country which follows the rule of law. The assumption that everybody has a fair go in this society. The assumption that this land was not inhabited before it was colonised in the most brutal fashion. And in order to do that, you can do all the charity work you like. You can work for over 4 decades like I have as a medical practitioner. You can jump up and down on social media. You can click as many buttons as you like and get click RSI. But the reality is, unless we organise as a political party that is willing to take on that challenge, nothing will change. So I encourage you, with a federal election around the corner, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest. If we don't get enough members before this federal election, we will get them before the next federal election. We are not some gossamer Finn party which will blow away in the wind. We are here for the long haul. We will be involved in parliamentary struggle, extra-parliamentary struggle, community struggle, issue-orientated struggle, and we will ensure, with your help and your assistance, that things will be radically transformed in Australia today. Because if they're not radically transformed, we face huge problems, not just in terms of a climate emergency, but in terms of social isolation, in terms of increasing mental health issues, in terms of not being able to provide for the basic necessities of our ageing population. Think about it. Join public interest before corporate interests. Join as soon as possible. We have over 450 members on the electoral roll. We need another 100 and we'll be able to apply for registration as a federal political party. If we don't succeed before this federal election, we will be there for the next federal election.